Dr. Enoch Hill, welcome to TheologyU. We're talking about big theological ideas, having intentionally accessible conversations recorded here at Harvard Divinity School. Dr. Hill, thanks for coming on. It's really good to see you.
Great to see you. It's so fun.
Let's start with where'd you grow up and how'd you get interested in economics in the first place? And why'd you
Sure.
stick with it?
Where I grew up. So I grew up in Minnesota, in the Twin City area, and my parents, they were missionaries, and then they became missionary senders. So they felt like there was a big need, more for people to support missions than for people to be on the field, or at least they felt like that's where the bottleneck was. And honestly, that's like maybe one of the most quintessential econ decision making ways of thinking that I could think of. And even though I didn't know that they were doing economics at the time, it just seemed so natural to me. So in undergrad, I started out as a computer science major, and it was great, it was going fine, but I didn't love it. And so I thought, maybe I should explore some. So then I tried out mathematics, and that was going well too. And then I took an econ class, and it just unlocked the world. It made sense of so many things I didn't understand previously, and it felt natural. It just felt like, oh yeah, this is how it works. This is for me. So I stuck with it. And at the time, I was reading Piper, Desiring God, and he has this concept that he calls it Christian hedonism. But basically, he's like, the reason we want to follow God isn't because we don't sacrifice everything for no purpose. We sacrifice everything for for something so much greater, something that far surpasses the value of everything we give up in the process. And it just, that way of thinking about my faith aligned so well with what I was learning in my econ classes. It transformed, the two studies at the same time transformed one another, and haven't looked back.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I had the opposite experience. I came in as an econ major and
Okay.
stuck with it and finished it, but I picked up the theology and the Bible and theology major later, and now obviously in grad school. But it's funny that you landed on econ after a few other things. I'm really pumped to have you on here to talk about economics and faith. Obviously, a really thoughtful guy in that manner. So let's start with how do you approach it in general? Economics, faith, how do you reconcile them? Where do they conflict?
Sure. So once I started my econ studies, then it kind of like transformed the way I read the Bible. So for one example, and I use it in a lot of classes, but in the Sermon on the Mount, I just can't help but see economic principles at play in the way that Jesus talks to the crowds. So, for example, in Matthew 6, he says, Don't stir up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but instead store up treasure in heaven, where your treasure isn't at risk." Um, and so basically, he's talking about maximizing, and that we have to make trade offs. Evidently, we can't store up both, and so one is more valuable than the other. Or he says, don't do your works to receive praise from men. Do your work, when you pray and when you fast and when you give, don't do it for the praise of men, do it for the praise of God, which far surpasses, do it for the greater.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I had thought that we were supposed to just die to ourselves, period, end of sentence. But we die to ourselves so that we can come and live. And I think there's a mysterious process that happens, that we ultimately realize that like our greatest joys lie in the joy of God and the joy of others, and they can't ever be found in ourselves. So that death is really, in some sense, real, but it also leads to something far greater than you could ever obtain, uh, without it. And thinking like an economist actually unlocked like a passion for my faith that I don't know if it was there, prior.
Yeah, it's so cool. It's such a good perspective. Tell me what, for someone who doesn't know economics, didn't take it in school, what is thinking like an economist? How would you
Yeah,
sum
great
it up?
question.
Yeah.
So, when most people talk about economics and they haven't had much historical background, they think about the economy, which is reasonable since
Mm-hmm.
it shares a lot of the name, and they think about money. And now that certainly has something to do with economics, or you can use economics to think about money. But economics is typically defined as the study of the allocation of scarce resources. And so when we think about scarcity, scarcity isn't a word that means a small amount. It means that it's a relative term. So I always use the example of nuclear waste and oil. Nuclear waste in the world, we produce less than 1,000 barrels of nuclear, or less than a barrel of nuclear waste for every 1,000 barrels of oil. We produce way more oil. but we don't know what to do with the nuclear waste we have. And even though we have like so much oil, it's still scarce because there's more things we want to do with the oil we have than the amount of oil freely available. And so the study of how we make those choices of what to do with it, given we don't have enough to satisfy all our desires, that's economics. And so another way of thinking about it is you don't have to make choices unless something's scarce. Whenever you choose, like, do I want to do this podcast with Will, or do I want to get ahead of my lesson planning? There's some fundamental resource that's scarce. So in that example, it could be time or attention. And whenever something is scarce, you have to choose. So how we choose, that's economics, which has everything to do with faith.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And having it laid out that way, I had the same experience you did with economics in the first place, of just my brain exploding. That was the first of several. The next one was when I started taking theology classes. But the econ stuff really sticks with you because you're right. It gives you matrices for decision making
Yeah.
and figuring out what to do with, yeah, limited time, limited everything. What is the most, how do you see it in your personal life or in your work life? Where do you feel econ and the way the frameworks impact your actual life, actual decisions in real time?
Well, like I think they come up all of the time. So I think one of the key thought processes that econ helps you with is realizing that everything you say yes to is saying no to other things. So like so often we hyper focus on the benefits or we hyper focus on the costs, but we don't bring them in tension with one another. So like when I choose to continue to work on improving my slides for my class tomorrow, I have to think about, well, what resource am I sacrificing? And that's probably my time. Most commonly, it's the answer is time and attention. And that means I can't be giving my time and attention to my kids or to my wife. And so there's a real trade-off there. And there's probably a point in time where continued work on my slides is not worth the cost of not being in relationship with these people I love so much. And I think that thinking about those trade-offs can help a lot of people improve the way they approach decision making. Like I don't think a lot of things that we think of as maybe problematic, I don't know if we can put our fingers on it as clearly as the economists can. So for example, when people scroll social media, I think most of us have this vague notion that we're kind of slaves to it and we don't want to do it more. I was reading about teens and social media use, as so many people do these days. Uh, and and I don't think the real tragedy is actually the social media use. I think it's all of the things that are lost because of all the time that is spent on social media use. It's not having the real life conversations. It's not taking the time to study for your econ test coming up.
Yeah. Yeah, that it's so true. And I think about it even on a bigger scale with church attendance and how that's an economic decision, and the decision to, yeah, spend devotional time with Jesus or to do anything faith related or not, when now you have this ever present available source of entertainment for
Exactly.
free instantly. And yeah, that's not something people had to reckon with really until now. At the very least, at least when it was after a certain hour, you ran out of stuff to do. It was read a book, talk to somebody, or go to bed. And now that whole matrix has changed, and it's been gradual with TV. I mean, you saw a big cultural shift when TV started, with people
That's
watching
right.
TV at night. But it's even more dramatic and more on demand and more personalized, um, just in every way. It's really a new thing.
Well, and this idea of opportunity cost, it is kind of mind blowing. Like another way to think about it is, what is the cost? What are some ways of thinking about the cost of your time? So right now, suppose that you've got your undergraduate degree. So what's the cost of your studies at Harvard Divinity School? Well, you probably could get a job now that pays maybe, I don't know, $40, $50 an hour. So every hour you spend not working, one of the options, and probably not the best one, but one of the options would be earning $40 with that time per hour. When you were a kid, what is the opportunity cost of your time?
Yeah, 50
Probably
cents.
50 cents an hour. And so
Yeah.
like actually the cost of play as a kid is just so beautifully free. Like free time doesn't exist for most people, but for kids it's just so beautifully free. Like they have this freedom to engage in creativity and play, and that free time exists for a short period of their lives, and it's just precious, like it's just so beautiful because it doesn't last in that same way. Like now if I were to engage in free play, it's still wonderful, I still love doing it, but now I'm giving up so many other things, like making sure that I'm involved in like mentoring or receiving from in relationships with people at work, or giving to my kids or my wife, or volunteering in the community, etc.
Yeah, and that's where I think the tool of measuring things with utility, because it can be money or time, but you're right, it can be the value of a relationship. And how do
Mm-hmm.
you quantify that and map that out as a what is the better use of your time is really the challenge of econ.
It is.
And I think of it as it pertains to our faith now in a more concretely money example. In this case, is stewardship.
Totally.
Stewardship of your time for volunteering or being a good Christian. You have kids, spending time with your kids. That's a worthwhile use of your time, or with your wife, or mentoring, or doing landscaping at church. But it's also your money, and where does your money go? And how do we allocate it not only individually, but as a unit, whether you're looking at a local church or even bigger, is how do we allocate all of the stuff we have when everyone is making their own individual utility maximizing decisions for what they're going to do?
Right.
I'm curious how you see it play out in church life with stewardship of your resources and your time.
So I think so. One thing that I often preach to my students or teach my students, but also in like reflecting about this intersection with our faith, is that I think that most of us, if we're being honest, in the church, we've come to a point, or at least this is my description of myself, and is like there's so many times in my life where I want to want God more. Like I would love to love God more, but I want to be at the point where I just can say I love God. And like theoretically I love God and I'm very thankful for all he's done. And so there's two ways to think about this as it relates to economics. So one is there's an economic concept called revealed preferences. And so like if I say I love God, but when it comes head to head with like spending another hour in prayer or watching some sports on TV, and I choose to watch sports on TV, my revealed preferences is that I want that, at least in that moment, more than I want to spend time in communion with God. Or if I have, a little bit of extra, or if I'm thinking about what to do with my budgeting, and I choose to buy something over donating it to the church or giving it to the poor, I'm revealing that my preference is places more weight on whatever I do end up buying than what I did do naturally. And so I think that's one interesting reflection on our hearts as it relates to faith and the allocation of our resources regarding economics. But I think there's a second thing that I think that I've come to appreciate even more, and that is, so economists, just like Aquinas, or not Aquinas, Augustine, would define like the core of a person by their utility functions, by what they value. I think Augustine would say, you are what you love. You're defined by your love. You're not at rest until until your love is at rest, until like what you love is you're in communion with that. And the economist would define the person by their desires. But I think that, as hopefully as you develop as an economist, you start to think of that as your loves. And one of the biggest questions that economists cannot answer is, how do you transform your loves? I think so when you strip away all that I am, like my talents, my abilities, my resources, whether that's my physical strength or my money, those things are all like stuff connected to me. But the me, like when I think about what am I, the economist would say, well, you are what you love. So to become a new creation in Christ, what does that mean? I think it's to have your loves transformed. And think about, how do we do that? How do I stop loving to love God, but just loving God? And I think we can go back to the Sermon on the Mount. And this is not econ. This is Jesus. He says, so, don't store up treasure on earth, store up treasure in heaven, because it's not going to rust and wear out or be stolen. But then he says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So he says your loves are formed by where you place the things you currently treasure. And I think that I found that to be true. Like and that's where I think like spiritual disciplines come in as it relates to economics. Like if right now I would love to love God more, but I can't just say like I love God freely without qualification. I found times in my life where I start giving him the things I do value more, like early mornings or other resources, my attention. I start to find that my loves are naturally transformed. And this happens in community. It can happen even despite ourselves. Like I'm sure if you've had the experience of going to a conference or to camp and just being like super energized, because you were giving all of your attention and all of your time and probably some serious monetary resources to attend those things. So
Yeah,
that's a lot.
that's a great crossover. I mean, there's so much there. I love the Augustine crossover, and I want to come back to that. I have a lot of questions for you now. The first one being is how do you map? And like you said, we can't quantify with economics. How do we transform our loves? I used to work with high school students, and I used to tell them that if you can wake up 10 minutes earlier than you normally do for school and spend those 10 minutes with God, if you really believe Jesus to be who he says he is,
Yeah.
a miracle worker, you don't think he can give you the energy? Because the pushback is, I don't get enough sleep.
Yeah.
And I say, if you think Jesus can raise people from the dead, you don't think he can give you the extra 10 minutes of sleep worth of energy that you missed out by waking up if you make that gesture. And that there's something that you can't quantify with economics. But which I think adds on to this problem of you are what you love. And Augustine has talk about holding up the test of time.
Yeah.
I mean, the theology that has stuck and holds true. But I'm curious if you think that decision or that revealed preference with your loves, how much of it comes down to also not critically thinking? Like in an instance where you have an easier option, think of social media or flip it on the TV
Mm-hmm.
versus getting up, going to a quiet place and entering into devotional time with God or doing that hard work or that uncomfortable, vulnerable work. Could it just be a matter of you're not critically thinking and you're making that easy decision because you don't want the discomfort of sitting with that decision? Or do you think it always reveals that that other thing is more important to you?
I've got two ways to think about this. So two answers to the question. One is if you're thinking like a traditional economist, you'd say, well, one of the scarce resources you have is like concentration. So if you've read, what's the book? It's Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Like apparently we
Mm-hmm.
have a very, very limited amount of conscious brain space. And so maybe you're saying your revealed preference is not to give enough thought. Your revealed preference is not using much of that like conscious brain space to figure out what you're going to do. And you've just decided like just letting your autopilot run to decide whether you scroll social media or whether you do something else. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way is to think, I mean, so many disciplines have these ideas, and economists are like way behind schedule and catching up, and they're starting to develop things with like hyperbolic discounting. But basically the idea, does Aquinas write about the will and the appetite? Who writes about the will and the appetite?
That sounds right to me.
Okay. So or Paul writes about it. We can just go to Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Like the things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I do.
Yeah.
And that, like, what does that even mean from the economist's perspective? We assume that people are rational actors, and that rational acting, it means a lot less than most non-economists think it means. It means that you basically make decisions because you want things. You make decisions. Maybe you could be rational and just want to accumulate infinite, all of the chopsticks in the world, and that would still be like rational as long as you could tie the reasons you acted to getting more chopsticks. So it doesn't have to look rational from the outside. It just has to be. It's just saying like our actions are motivated by objectives. But you're saying like sometimes you're just sitting on the couch and you actually want to know God better, but you're too lazy to actually engage in conscious thought to think about how your social media is distracting you from that.
Yep.
And I
Or
think,
or like falling into persistent sin. People would often say, I don't want that. And
yeah,
it's the same thing you're saying is what your revealed preference is it to do things that you know are harmful to yourself? And it's hard to model because I want to say no. I want to say the sincere desire is to pursue holy behaviors or to not do that thing that you know is wrong. And yet your revealed preferences reveal that this other thing has this apparent value to you, which just seems to me hard to model.
I think there's two people in ourselves. Like I think all of us carries this will and this appetite. So the will is like who we are at 5 a.m. when our alarm's going off.
Yep.
And we want to sleep another 10 minutes and we press snooze, or like at night we're having a good time with our friends and we know it's time to like get to bed or start studying for a test or whatever it might be. And that's the appetite, excuse me. That's the appetite that like drives us to those things. And the will is us saying like at 1 p.m, I want to be the type of person that wakes up at 5 a.m. Or
Right.
the will is like at 6 p.m. setting my alarm for 5 a.m. and being like, I will get up and I will spend time with God, or I will work out, whatever it is that we hope to achieve. And I think that those two things are a constant tension with one another, and they both have like different sets of values and preferences. And I think a lot of people think the will is virtuous and the appetites are evil. I don't think I agree with that. Like, I think probably a lot of the most diabolical plans were well thought through and organized and implemented. So that, there's an evil there. But when we're saying like, I wanted to study all night, but I ended up falling asleep, or I ended up hanging out with friends and getting distracted, or I fell into some sinful habit again. I think a lot of that is this competition between the will and the appetite, which are like two different entities that are both in us.
Yeah, yeah, and there's something Augustinian in there as well
Yeah, I think so.
of just disordered loves of, you have this capacity for love, and what are you doing with it? Are you directing it to the right places? And I'm glad you brought up Daniel Kahneman. I love talking about him, and Thinking Fast and Slow is an amazing book. Michael Lewis actually wrote a biography of him and one of his colleagues called The Undoing Project, I think, which is also a sweet book. It's basically a biography
Tell
of
me more.
Kahneman and his work.
Okay.
Um, it's good stuff. Uh, One thing that stuck out to me from Kahneman is anchoring. I don't know if you ever think
Yeah.
about that. Um, but I think about that in my regular life all the time
Yeah. How
because
does
you
it come
see
up?
it. Well, I notice other people doing it.
Okay.
Part of it to me is kind of like that book. What is it? The Rules of Power book, where he kind of gives you these ways that humans are easily deceived, or these traps we fall into. And I think part of the battle is not using them, because I have no interest in manipulating people, but I see anchoring all the time
Do you
at
want
a
to define
cart.
anchoring, or do you
Oh
think?
yeah, yeah, yeah. We'll slow down. So anchoring, and correct me if I'm wrong, but anchoring is basically when you approach a negotiation and you throw out a number or a term that's extreme, and it anchors the midpoint in that direction. So say I'm buying a car from you, and I say I'll buy the car for $50. It's it's comically low, but research has proven that even throwing out that poor initial guess makes the negotiation go more in your favor because it anchors lower. And so I see it all the time in ads and whatnot. Anyway, that's a
Mhm.
bit of a tangent, but I think Kahneman's really brilliant, and
Oh yeah, absolutely.
that's a great book recommendation.
Yeah.
Um, but keep going. Econ and faith. Where else do you see it? And I love how you're using scripture. This is helpful for me.
Yeah.
So
No, I
keep
mean, I've been
going.
thinking a lot about scarcity and the blessing of scarcity. So a
Hmm.
lot of times, so I was reading Genesis, and I am not a theologian, so you'll have to go talk to your profs and get back
No,
to me.
no.
But in the fall, in chapter 3 of Genesis, there's like the curse to the serpent, to the woman, and to the man, and then there's a couple verses after that, and basically God's like, well, we can't let uh, humans have access to the fruit of the tree of life anymore. Otherwise, they would eat and live forever and be like us. And I've always wondered. I thought that was part of the curse. And the formatting in my Bible switches there. It switches back to like normal formatting. I have no idea if that's significant in any way, so I don't want to put any weight on that. But it got me thinking, like, well, what is scarcity? And so scarcity is having less of a resource than things we want to do with it. So all of a sudden, there's a finite amount of time humans get on Earth. Um, And so then what would it be to not have that finite amount of time, given that humans have sinned and we're separated from God? And what do we call like infinite time separated from God?
Hmm.
Like, I think theologically we call it hell, right? Like, and what is hell? I think it's having more of a resource of time than good things to do with that resource. So there, I do know this one's Aquinas. Like, nothing is infinite but God. So if we truly believe that, if like eventually we'd run out of good things to do, if we had infinite time. Like, eventually we'd have read all the books, we'd have written all the things we wanted to do, we'd have talked about all the things we want to talk about. We'd just be sitting there with like infinite time, but
Yep.
nothing worthy of all that time. I think
Yep.
eventually we'd be like, man, this is hell.
Yeah, that's a good way to flip kind of that. So many people are intimidated by the thought of infinity, of infinite eternal life.
Yeah.
I remember even being a kid and being really intimidated by that. But that's an interesting turn of face to be actually. It's even scarier to think of infinity in the other direction of if you have infinite time and then you still run out of things to do. That's it. I like that turn of phrase. And yeah, I was hoping we'd get to scarcity. Even just a couple days ago in class, we did a thought exercise on moral imagination about your dream world, about using your creativity to think about a world unbound by our current circumstances. And somebody in my class said one of their primary characteristics of their dream world, their fantasy world, was no death, a world without death.
Yeah.
And I thought, that sounds terrifying. And in what ways are, and I'd love to hear you elaborate on this, in what ways is it a blessing to have scarce time, at least on this planet, A, as a motivator to do things? I find that to be true. But B, just psychologically, the idea of scarcity. It's so baked into our humanity, I think, in so many ways.
Yeah, well, I think that there's several things. So one of them is like I had this experience as a kid. Have you ever played SimCity or Civilization or
Yeah.
any?
Yep.
You played SimCity. Okay.
Yes.
So I played SimCity as a kid, and basically you're a
Hold on.
dictator
On the computer?
on the computer,
Yeah.
old
The
school. I played the
CD?
Super Nintendo, Super Nintendo,
Okay.
so like
Nice.
long time ago, and you're basically you get to decide all the zoning rules. You get to build parks and other things, put in roads for a small city, and you try to attract residents. And there's all forms of scarcity. There's like geographical scarcity. There's only so much space, so if you build tons of roads, you get less congestion, but you don't have more as much space for residential or commercial zones. And but the scarcest resource is money. It's easy to run out of money, and then you got to wait for taxes to come in. And if you tax too much, citizens get mad and they move away. So I know I was enjoying the game, and me and my brother were playing together. And then one day, someone at school tells us there's a cheat code, and you get infinite money, all the money you want. And so we were super excited, and we get home and we put in the cheat code, and it works. And then we just build everything. Like we build everything we've been wanting to build, like a bunch of stadiums, a bunch of parks, like high capacity, more efficient, not roads, but public transportation. So we build all this stuff, and it's like 15 minutes later, and we've done everything, and then we quit. We're kind of bored, and we quit playing the game, and I don't think we played again. Like it just ruined it, right?
Yeah.
Like the elimination, the scarcity is what made the game interesting, and it's what made the game meaningful. And I think like think of it if you didn't have any of the limits that you have today. So if you had infinite time, like how much less meaningful would it be when you gave time to somebody? Like we know that there's something really precious happening when we have a conversation because both people are giving up all the other things they could do to have that conversation. But if you had infinite of it, it would just be like just like one more thing. It like heightens the beauty of it. I think one thing that's so meaningful about marriage is that you're saying no to every other relationship, and you're saying like I'm going to have this relationship that is more deep than any other relationship in my life. And like that's how much I value this thing. And it's the cost of having to say like I am not omnipresent. I cannot be with everyone at once. I have to, if I'm going to choose to be with you, I'm choosing, way less time with my friends. I'm choosing not to be as committed to my work. And there's something really precious and beautiful about that. And I think it like helps us reflect on like what it is that God is offering us between, the marriage between the church and Christ. So I get really excited talking about
Yeah. I immediately went to relationships halfway through. So I'm glad you did. Because it's so true. You have somebody saying no to 7 billion people and saying yes to one for as long as they're on the planet. And what a
yeah,
powerful thing that is.
yeah,
And yeah, how meaningless it quickly becomes when that's not the case. I remember you gave me a long time ago, and I don't remember if this was just to me or in class, but you gave us dating advice that was
okay, tell me
somewhat
some.
related,
Okay.
about taking periods to evaluate
Oh
and
sure,
then
yeah.
periods to enjoy being with somebody. And I'd love to hear you talk about that because that's related to this topic of kind of you have limited time. How are you going to do with it? How are you going to deal with it and live a happy relationship? So if you remember that, could
Yeah, I
you kind of
do. I
elaborate?
don't know if this is econ, but it is something that seems to be true for me. So I found that I can only be in experiencing mode or in evaluation mode, and I
Mm.
don't feel like I can do both at the same time. So maybe that's where the econ comes in. You got to
Yeah.
choose one or the other.
But so I mean, I feel like it's a scarce use. You have scarce time to use these ways of living your life, right? Like
Yeah,
these modes.
yeah. And so and so And so my advice, I think, is as it comes to dating or a new job, is to not switch into evaluation mode too fast. So I think often we try to do both at the same time to our detriment and to the detriment of the people we're with. So like in a new job or in a new relationship, I encourage students to start with just experiencing. just say like, just try to enjoy it as much as you can. Try to enjoy the new person. Try to learn about them. Try to uh, enjoy the ambiance, enjoy whatever it is that you can experience, or with your job, try to learn as much as possible and pour yourself into it. But set a point in time. We're going to switch modes. We're going to switch to evaluation mode, and then maybe it's after a couple weeks, or maybe with your job it's after 6 months or a year, and then you switch and say like, I'm going to take a week to reflect on everything I love about this job, everything I haven't loved, everything that I'd want to change, and really think if this is what I want to continue to do. But to not to but to, I think we cheapen both the experience and the evaluation if we're doing both at the same time always.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm curious, back to scarcity in general. What's your way of measuring when you're using your time appropriately, your scarce resource of time? Because obviously it can't be making you feel good all the time. That can't be your evaluator, your,
Yeah, yeah.
what's the word I'm looking for? Your ultimate source of value, your measure of utility. How do you know, and how do you make those decisions of what's good, considering
Yeah.
your faith? Like what is you can say for sure this is a valuable use of my time instead of everything else.
That's a tricky one. So I'm sure this is what I actually do, and I'm gonna now retroactively back it up with some of like philosophical theological thinking.
Perfect.
I'm not sure if this is fair. I mean, I'm sure that I waste about as much time as everybody else. Like, I mean, I get a lot done. I can be fairly disciplined, but like, I don't want to give any impression that I'm like hyper thoughtful as an economist about every minute of my time.
Yeah.
Um, but here's how I think about it. So in the Garden of Eden, there's all the trees out there, and what is God's will for Adam and Eve?
Live together in community, worship him.
Yeah, totally, right? And how about what trees can they eat from?
All of them but one.
All of them but one, right? Like I think that so what would have been a good use of time for them?
Obedience, doing their thing, whatever they want.
Right, almost anything. Like
Yeah.
obedience, yes, absolutely. But obedience didn't mean eating the fruit from one tree and eating the specific, pear from, the third branch on the left.
Yeah.
It was like doing almost anything. And I think as far as it comes to using time, there's like basic principles. Like there's certain activities that are just, we know are detrimental. There's other things that we kind of know are wasting our time. And I think that like God in his graciousness and goodness kind of like will let us know. Like, I don't think there's ever been something I'm doing that's a waste of time where at least pretty quickly on, I kind of get this nudge in my heart, or who knows like what it's called, where I'm like, this is probably a waste of time. And it's not like, do I have to sit and divine carefully like exactly how many minutes I should do of this? More often than not, it's like probably worth being done with this now, right? And I think we need to be attentive to those nudges, but there's also this freedom. Like I think that there's a lot more freedom than we think. Like I don't think it's like now cross the street with minute 5 through 6 of the day, and then with minute 7 through 15 I should be like, or for the next 2 hours I should be hyper focused on writing 4 paragraphs for my book, etc. I think it's more like God gave us preferences, he gave us a mind, and we can use those things. And if God was ever to say something like, I want you to go up to that person and like your last conversation, go up to that person and give him a rug, then you got to do it. Then you got to do that specific thing. But that if he's not nudging you away from something or towards something, and and you're living generally, if you're living within the bounds of what you understand God, God's call in your life, there's a ton of freedom. And I don't think you need to be caught up with like mapping out every single instant.
Yeah, it's very freeing, and that's what I was trying to get at. And yeah, our last conversation, which will be uploaded before this one, is with John Mark Dyer, and he talks about this instance where he has this Holy Spirit prompting to give over a rug, and it ends up being this really profound moment. And those moments are cool and special and worth paying attention to. But
Absolutely.
also there's so many opportunities for us to look back and potentially regret how we used our time when we look at it in such a strict way that's not sympathetic and giving grace to ourselves. It could be any matter of things. It could be playing a sport. Maybe you devoted a ton of time growing up or even in college playing a sport or playing an instrument, and it doesn't end up being what you use for your career, and maybe you don't feel like you brought a bunch of people to Christ doing it. it doesn't mean it's a waste of your time. And there's that God constantly revealing process to us as you walk with Him. And I think that's the divine mystery too, of walking with Him day by day, minute by minute, and following those feelings when you think it's bad. We talked about it with social media. You have those gut feelings sometimes of I'm simply wasting my time. I could be doing something better. But I find those instances are pretty rare, especially when you're doing something of relative meaning, especially if it's with somebody else or it's enriching you in any kind of way. I think it's important to make that point that it's not this strict, always mathematical judgment of am I maximizing my time? Am I doing the best I can with my gifts? Because I think that just becomes paralyzing and
Totally.
anxiety inducing and unhelpful. So,
I do think getting some I do think like going into evaluation mode sometimes, a limited amount of the time, is helpful. Like to say, okay, I'm going to spend this morning out of the whole next 3 months. I'm going to spend this morning really reflecting on my priorities. Like one thing I come to is just the relative if like the magnitude of someone transforming their eternity. You know, like when someone comes to Christ, like it even if heaven was just like marginally better, but it lasts for eternity, the value on that, and I mean I don't think that's what it is. I think it's far greater than that. But even if it was like the magnitude of what just happened is hard to understate.
hard to
It's hard to
overstate.
overstate.
Impossible. Well,
Impossible to
how about
overstate.
impossible to overstate?
Impossible to overstate.
Yeah.
And I just heard this incredible story of this woman who was a historian, and she was an atheist, and she was studying church history, and she was constantly interviewing leaders in the church, and she just loved those conversations, and really struggled and lamented because she so wanted the things that she saw in these church leaders, but didn't feel like she could lie to herself and believe something she didn't believe. And eventually, like the amazing story, the end of the story is that she became a Christian. Like just the last year, she got baptized, and like it's transformed her life, which is awesome. But one thing that a friend shared with me is that in all of these interviews, only two people, like she interviewed Keller and N.T. Wright and all these people, only a couple people ever shared with her the gospel, right? Like actually talked to her about what she wanted, and it struck me as like I do think that there's the relative importance of sharing the good news of the kingdom, the gospel with people, like the thing that Christ constantly tells his apostles after his resurrection is to be witnesses, right? So if there is one area where I would like to use my time better, it is being a little more bold in that respect.
Yeah, but it's a good reminder too of just the nuance of life and
Yeah,
the complexity of life and all those conversations that you have. It's easy to look when it's a pastor and when someone's telling the story of I talked to this pastor. But those instances happen all throughout your life without you even knowing about it. And that to me is part of the joy of, when we do in the end, I think we'll get to look back and see all those moments that you didn't know you had an impact or you didn't know that God was on the move. And you get to see all those ways that aren't explicitly doing what John Mark does, giving over the rug. When you have that unique prompting, and I think that's what you're saying, to be bold when you have that conviction in the moment. But that there's also so many more things that go into it, to witnessing and to living
absolutely.
out what Jesus calls us to do.
No, I actually think this conversation is super clarifying for me. So thanks for inviting me to have it. I would rephrase that. I think that actually what I hope to do with my life is I think we are supposed to act in an authentic manner in who we are and who God's made us to be. But I do think that there's ways, such as investing our treasure in things that really matter, that transform our loves. And I think one thing that we're constantly called to do is to deepen our love for God and deepen our love for our neighbor. And I think that as that happens, it will become like right now, I know conceptually the magnitude of the importance when someone becomes a Christian. But I often would expect my soul to rejoice more than it does, if I'm being, totally
Mm.
transparent.
Mm.
And I think that I don't want to tell someone to come to Christ or to enter into this relationship that has been transformative in my life because it's like a checklist thing or a thing I think conceptually it was good to do. I want to do it because it's like my deepest joy. It would be my deepest joy. And I would believe it is their deepest joy to have this transformation happen, such that it was like the overflowing of everything in me, such that I couldn't contain myself but do that thing, which is much different than saying like I should be doing this thing, but I'd rather scroll social media another hour. Like I think those are two very different things. And I think investing our hearts and our treasures and our minds and our talents are ways that we form our loves to naturally predispose us to desire nothing more than to tell our neighbor.
Yeah, Richard Hayes is a New Testament scholar at Duke. He's retired now, but he wrote the Moral Vision of the New Testament in
I've read
I think
parts
the
of it.
late '90s, and in there he write in the very beginning. So you may have read it. He writes that because he's pushing against legalism, and he writes that obedience to God's word is the natural outflowing of a Christian. It's not what you must do. It's not what you should do. He says it is what happens. He
Right.
says it's the natural flow. And that
That's
was
so
really
good.
clarifying for me when I read it, because it's kind of this escape from, oh, I have to do this, or this guilt narrative of, oh, I have to do this because, or someone told me I had to do this. It's like, no. And that's the process of being sanctified, I think, too, is like you're saying, transforming your loves, is making it more natural, is letting it become more and more who you are when you become the new person, when you get the new heart,
Yeah.
is how do you make it natural, and how do you make it your greatest joy? Like you're saying, how do you make worship your greatest joy? I think you feel that periodically, like a moment of euphoria worshiping,
Yeah.
but not all that often.
Mm-hmm.
And it's how do you get that more? How do you direct, to go back to Augustine, how do you direct your love at the right place?
Yeah.
And I think part of the ways that you know that is by the way you react, is the feedback that your body gives you, is what am I reacting to? What am I deriving joy from? I
Mm-hmm.
think will tell you where you're directing your attention, and how natural is it, or how much are you filtering, oh, that should be significant to me, so it's giving me joy. Like you're saying, is it giving me as much joy as it should?
Yeah.
Or am I having to work for it?
Yeah. And there's some sort of misalignment. Have you found sometimes there's misalignment. So how have you found ways in the movement of aligning like your theoretical, what you would love to love, and your actual loves? Have you found success in doing that?
I tried. I think I think it comes back to what you said with with spiritual disciplines, and taking that time to be evaluative and make those decisions when you're making that critical evaluation, and then acting on it. And then to a certain level, you have to just do it. You have to do the things that you know. And I think that's a gradual process of deciding I'm going to spend time with God, or I'm going to act on a conviction to talk to somebody, talk to a stranger, or share the gospel, or give money away, or do something like that. And then I think once you, to a certain level, the Holy Spirit acts in you, but to a certain level, you just have to do it. You just have to wake up. You have to get out of bed and read your Bible, or you just have to do the thing that's scary. You have to have the conversation, or you're in a conversation with a friend and you're like, oh, I know I should ask this, but I don't want to. You just have to do it. And then I think in that process, you do it once and you see, oh, it goes well. Or you open the door and then God moves in a really marvelous way because you took that initial step. And then that says, okay, I'm going to try to do it again. And I think that's just how you have to live that out and work it out, is at first by just sitting down and contemplating prayerfully, what do I do? And then just doing it. You have to decide to do it a lot of times.
No, I do think it's an intentional thing. Like, so I'm going to steal from Dan Ariely, and I know, and he has this like little talk where he imagines that he's at a park, and he's like, I'm here at the park. I have my kids here, and then maybe one of his students pass by. So maybe Will, you can be my student. You can pass by.
Perfect.
I'll be like, hey Will, what do you think of my kids? They're those three kids on the playground, and you might be nice and be like, oh yeah, they're really cute. They're great. And I'd be like, well, do you think they're really like how precious are they? And if you're being kind, you'd be like, oh, they're like of infinite value. And I'd be like, oh great, because they're for sale. And I'd be like, well, how much do you want to pay for them? And you probably would be like, well, actually, if you want me to watch them, I'll watch them, but you got to pay me because that's how this works. And like, and yet I do feel this incredible affinity and attachment and desire for good things to happen to my children. Like if they're rejected at school, I just feel it so deeply. And if they have like a great day, like I feel so much joy from that.
Mm.
And I don't think it's random. And I don't think it's even, I think it's partially genetic, but I think it's even more than that, because I suspect that if I adopted a kid, I would feel the same about that adopted kid as my biological children. Like eventually, probably not the day they arrived at our house, but like what, and I come back to Matthew 6 again. Like, I think it's through the repeated actions of giving up things that I previously thought were valuable in order to invest in my kids, like giving up all my hobbies, right? And spending a ton of my attention that I would have liked to spend like reading more books, focused on like very mindless games with kids repeatedly. That's like almost incredible, like really hard for me to do. But over time, all of those things have caused my heart to be like deeply in love with my children. And I think the same. I think that's a principle. I think that's like the same magic that happens with God, is like, if you continuously give him your best, your heart will come to value that. Like, I think that's what Jesus was saying, but for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And I think that's the spiritual disciplines. But I think it could be more than that. Like, I think if my kids went on the mission field, I'd be like praying a lot more for the mission field.
Yeah, and there's a great promise that those who seek will find.
Mm-hmm.
And the Lord gives us that promise. But there's a certain level of mystery to that too, of who has the agency there. But I think you're right. I think it's, yeah, at some level, the only way to realize the treasure is to look, is
Yeah,
to pursue it, and to have your actions, like you said, to a certain level, to make your revealed preferences reveal the things you want them to. And
yeah,
to, if they're not, to be self reflective about that and to make some kind of change, whether it's in your value system or whether it's, by somehow changing your behavior or changing when you wake up or changing when you go to sleep or setting a screen time limit. I think there's something to that.
yeah. I do too. Yeah, you got. I mean, yeah, and I think ultimately there is also like the work of the Holy Spirit redemptively transforming our
Yep.
loves. I mean, I think that is fundamentally what it is to be a new creation, is to have at least the opportunity for your loves to align with the loves of God.
Yeah, and I don't want to underemphasize that either. And I think that's my earlier point of, at some point you can't model it. There becomes a point where it is an economic problem until it's not, until the transformational power of God, and like you said, the magnitude of how do we think about salvation? Those things cannot fit in a model because they so overwhelm Earth and what our brains can handle.
Totally.
And holding those things, because you want to be disciplined, you want to do the right things, but also you have to leave room and admit how feeble we are and
Yeah.
how much, at the end of the day, the Holy Spirit is the one doing the work and we're the
Absolutely.
vessels.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to hold, especially if you're someone who is more driven or more, big on your own agency.
Yeah.
Those things you just have. I think you wrestle with your whole Christian walk. Is
Totally.
who has the agency here, and am I willing to give it up?
Well, it doesn't seem like it's just Christians. I mean, like,
Yeah,
deterministic and reductionistic conversations in the natural sciences seem to be all the rage. So do we? Yeah. To what extent do we have any control?
yeah, and there's biology there with the pathways in your brain too,
Oh yeah.
about where are you deriving, um, even like basic, where are you getting your dopamine from, and what pathways have you carved in your brain? Are
Yeah.
you getting it from your kids? Are you getting it from your phone? Are you getting it from
Yeah.
whatever? It could be anything.
Yeah.
And those things are hard to reconcile with your faith. And I think it's helpful to have those conversations and to see the way God's wired us. But also, you have to hold both all the time. And
Mm-hmm.
it's this constant give and take of, I think, understanding who we are as humans and also understanding who made us in the first place and why we are the way that we are.
I mean, there's a great comforting element to just being really small and the sovereignty of God. Like in all of these conversations, kind of you were asking about making the right decisions, and
Yep.
how do you evaluate every moment of your time? And I found our incredible like relative insignificance to be one of the most comforting thoughts. And I know that this is kind of, I mean, I don't think that we're insignificant, but like God's in control, and like if I lost everything and I failed at everything and I like messed up repeatedly for the rest of my life and never figured anything out, or if I got really sick and paralyzed and could never take an action again, we already know the end of the story. Like God wins in the end, and ultimately, there's this incredible like assurance there, an incredible ability to just to know that even though I understand economic decision making, I don't. It's not ultimately dependent on me to make the right exact decisions at the right time, but that if I fail, like 100,000 years from now, I'll still exist for whatever reason. It's in God's will that we get eternity, and I'll be with Christ, and like He will win in the end. And there's this like freedom in that too. Just like I don't have to spend every minute correctly, I also have this freedom that I think if you don't have this type of theology, a freedom to like go for it, right? Like to shoot for the moon or the stars, and if you fail miserably and it all comes to ruin, like it doesn't actually change my idea of what life will look like 10,000 years from now.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a helpful way to think about stewarding our time and our resources is to say it matters, and it matters because God's given me the days. It matters because I'm here. But you're right, the victory's already won. It's not a matter of truly cosmic significance in so much as I'm trying to glorify the one who made me and live a
Yeah.
life worthy of the calling that I have. But it's a great reminder. Do you think there's a parallel with your kids maybe? Is you see, a kid who, like you said, has free time, literally free time,
Yeah.
or 50 cent per hour
50 cent
time.
time.
I like that. But you can watch them make decisions with their time and say, it's not insignificant what your kid does. But even compared to the perspective you have,
Mm.
it's very little. And it's not going to sway your emotions terribly if they make a wrong decision. And you love them just the same. So do you think do you see a parallel there?
I think I get what you're saying. Like when there's often times where like my kids will have been working on a tower for like 5 whole minutes, and then their brother or sister will come by and knock it down, and they'll feel like this great tragic event has transpired, and they'll wail and lament and feel like everything is ruined. And with my wise 40 plus years of perspective, I'll sit there and be like, this is not a big deal. And yet, like, I also glory in their triumphs, and like when they've like figured out how to play a song on the piano or they have a good soccer game, like I can rejoice with them, and I can feel their sorrow and their pain. And it's not like the things they do don't matter, but yeah, like I know that it's all going to be at least the things that they're worried about most of the time as 5, 7, and 9 year olds. I know that in the most cases it's going to be fine, and I
Yeah.
don't like stress in the same way they stress about these little things. And I bet God, is this what you're saying? Like that God looks
Yeah.
at us and kind of is like it's it's great that you're trying, and like I rejoice in the development that you're experiencing, but but it's gonna be okay.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to pull on is, and to say like when your kids are sad, it makes you sad. Like you care about
Totally,
that. You totally
totally,
care.
yeah,
But it's just a different perspective, and I think to then go from us to God is an even way more seismic difference in perspective. And to say, imagine His ability to say, as a God who is not bound by time, His capacity to say, it's good to steward your time, but His capacity to say, it's okay and it's going to be fine. And the end of the story is already written. It's
yeah,
done. And
amen.
I totally think it's so comforting. That's a great reminder. And I think a little bit of a surprising one from an economist. And I think it says a lot about how monumental Christian faith really is and how much it really
Yeah,
does order your preferences and direct your loves. I
totally.
think that's a good place to close it. I love this.
Me
Thanks
too.
for
It's
doing
been a
it.
fun conversation. If you ever want to talk more about econ and faith, I've got lots more things I'm thinking about. But this is a great place to end for sure.
Amazing. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for coming
Me too.
on. And
Hey, thanks for the invitation.
oh, it was great.